Tonight, we are in the book of Esther. And Esther is full of drama and it's full of suspense. It's about an orphan who becomes a princess. And there's tears, there's sorrow, there's great joy and celebration. There's a lot of feasting and fasting. And there is also some gore as well. And it's a story of rags to riches, where an orphan girl from an ethnic minority becomes the wealthiest woman and most powerful woman in the entire land. She is the star of the show, and literally her name means star. So before we open up God's word tonight, what we're going to do is I'm just going to give you a potted history of where we are. So there's a king. King Xerxes, he's a baddie. He's not a nice guy. And he decides that he's going to throw this elaborate banquet and for his nobles and his princes and his officials. And this banquet, it lasts for 180 days. And he's showing off basically his wealth and his splendor. And Persia was a world power, and the king was one of the wealthiest people in the whole of the world. And at the same time as that, his queen, Queen Vashti, she is also throwing a banquet for all the women in the palace. And everything is going really well up until the point when King Xerxes decides that he's going to summon his wife to come to him because he wants to show her off to all the men, and he wants basically the men to ogle her. And she's like, I'm not doing that. And so he banishes her from the kingdom.
What's ogling?
Oh, what's ogling? Like, I don't know, what's another word for ogling? Looking her up and down, Chuck, stop heckling me. For goodness sake, we've only just started. Anyway, he banishes Vashti, and then, of course, he's looking for another wife, another queen. And so he brings all the beautiful women from across the entire empire into his harem. And from all of them, he would choose just one to be his queen. And out of his entire harem, King Xerxes, he chose Esther, who was a Jewish orphan adopted by her uncle Mordecai. And the king, he loved Esther more than any other woman, and he crowned her as queen. And Esther, she hid her Jewish identity from the king. Now, in the meantime, the king promoted Haman, he's a baddie, to be prime minister. And he issued this decree. This is one of the first things that Haman did as prime minister. Wherever I walk, whatever I do, I want people to bow down to me. And so Mordecai, Esther's uncle, refuses to bow down to Haman. And obviously, this infuriates Haman so much. So he goes to the king and he takes with him 10,000 large sacks of silver. And he asks for permission to destroy the Jews. And the king agrees. And he issues an edict for all 127 provinces, saying that on the 7th of March next year, in one single day, every single Jewish man, woman, and child must be killed, slaughtered, and annihilated on one single day. Now, upon hearing this most horrifying edict, Mordecai, Esther's uncle, he goes into mourning. He's wearing sackcloth and ashes, and he quickly sends word to Esther. And he says, you've got to go to the king. You've got to stop this decree, this terrible thing that is going to happen. But Esther's afraid. She's scared to approach the king because the law is you're not to approach the king unless he summons you, because you are likely to face death. But Mordecai, he can see the bigger picture, and he sent back this answer to her. So if you have your Bibles with you tonight, we are going to be kind of all over the book of Esther, but we're going to start in Esther chapter 4, verse 13. I'm going to read it to you. This is what is said. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And so tonight we're going to look at what it means for us together to stand in the gap. Together to stand in the gap between heaven and earth for those who desperately need it. Now, when I read books of the Bible, there are some books that I wish I could have been there, I could have experienced for myself. I'm sure you will feel exactly the same. I would love to have been there when Moses parted the Red Sea. I mean, how awesome would that have been? I would have loved to be there, fly on the wall on Pentecost. When the disciples, they're in the upper room and then a violent wind comes and it's shaking the room and then tongues of fire are resting on their heads and they are filled with the Spirit. What an awesome thing to have witnessed that would be. Or, the account in Acts where the Apostle Paul, he's going on and on and on. And there's one lad who's sitting by the window and he's just kind of closing his eyes and then he's opening them again and then he's going again and opening them. And before you know it, this lad is in a very deep sleep by the window and he falls out the window. Oh my goodness, suddenly Paul's looking up. What's that noise? He's fallen out the window, runs down all the flights of stairs, throws himself over this young man. He's not dead, he's alive. It's okay. It's okay. It takes this saying, boring someone to death, to a whole new level, doesn't it? So many parts of the Bible that I would have loved to have been around. But the book of Esther, not so much. You see, the world that Esther lived in was horrifying. It was a time when the king and the leaders of the nation, they were selfish and wicked and immoral. It was a time where all sense of morality and decency had gone out the window. It was a time when human life was seen as cheap and worthless. Imagine allowing 200,000 people to be annihilated. It was a time when people lived for themselves. They were lovers of pleasure, lovers for themselves rather than of God. It was a time of worldly pomp and show. It's all about flashing the cash. It's all about image and beauty and sex and power. It was a time of debauchery of every kind. It was a time where the kings and the leaders of the nation neglected the people and its welfare. It was a time when the sanctity of marriage was disregarded, and it was a time when women were seen as and used as sexual objects. I could go on and on. Does any of that sound familiar? You see, Esther's world and our world aren't as far removed as we may think. In fact, our worlds are just the same. Just like God called and placed Esther into a specific time, into a specific place, God has called and he's placed us into a specific time, into a specific place for such a time as this. At such a time where men, women, and children are held against their will and they are forced to become slaves, domestic slaves, sex slaves. They're forced to commit crimes. They're forced to go into hard labor. At such a time where human life is sold as a commodity, at such a time is where marriage is as disposable as a takeaway dinner, at such a time where suicide is prevalent, at such a time where thousands and thousands of the most vulnerable children have to be taken away from their families. At such a time where millions of individuals and families are living in poverty. At such a time when homelessness is on the rise. At such a time as children as young as 9 are addicted to pornography. At such a time where drug and alcohol and gambling and all kinds of addictions are wrecking individuals and families' lives. At such a time where billions of people don't know Jesus. At such a time where the gap between the rich and the poor is increasing all the time, and the poor are being marginalized and squeezed. You see, it's clear through the story of Esther that God's hand and his favor was on her. Any one of those women in the king's harem could have become queen, but God allowed it to be Esther. And Esther enjoyed the favor of what it meant to be queen. She had more freedom and more authority than any other woman in the land. She enjoyed splendor and wealth, and she would have wanted for nothing. And we see the favor of the Lord over Esther's life. In Esther chapter 2, verse 15, it says, "When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who is in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her." But with favor comes the weight of responsibility and stewarding that well. And we see the responsibility that Esther needs to carry because of God's favor that's on her. In chapter 4, verse 14, this is what Mordecai says to her. "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." You see, the responsibility and the weight of Esther's task, it was daunting. It was immense. It was huge for her. Mordecai is urging her, you cannot remain silent. You have to go to the king. You have to do something. You see, with favor comes the responsibility to steward that into action. And we see Esther's actions in verse 15. This is Esther, and she sent this reply to Mordecai. "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I'll go to the king, even though it's against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. So we see here, Esther, she recognized the favor of the Lord that was upon her. She understood the responsibility of what that meant, and then she acted on it, risking everything. God is calling us at such a time as this to stand up and be counted. As Christians, we all receive and we all carry the favor of the Lord. And because of that, just like Esther, the responsibility is on us to make a difference in our homes, in our families, in our schools, in our universities, in our workplaces, and in our communities. To steward into action like never before. God has called every single one of us in this room for such a time as this, to stand in the gap. And what do we see Esther do? We see Esther stand up. We see her rise up with courage and with faith, with prayer and with fasting. And she stood in the gap for the Jewish nation. She stood in the gap for her people, for God's people. She stood in the gap for her friends and her family. She stood in the gap for the people that she'll never know and she'll never meet. She petitioned the king on their behalf. She interceded on their behalf. She was the go-between. Esther was willing to stand in the gap for those who cannot stand for themselves, for those known to her and for those that she will never meet. Accepting the call to stand in the gap is one of the most important things that we as Christians can ever do. Things happen when we stand in the gap. When we pray, things happen. Chains break, light shines into darkness, freedom comes, Faith rises up, peace invades, hope beckons, healing takes root, impossible situations happen. We're not here just to live our lives. We're here to have influence, to influence those around us, to influence our region, our city, our nation, our nations, to influence the world. God put his hope in Esther to save the Jewish nation, and God puts his hope in his church. His church is the light of the world. His church is the hope of the world. His church is God's appointed vessel to rise up and stand in the gap for the 50 million slaves in the world. To stand in the gap for the abandoned and the orphaned and the widowed. To stand in the gap for the soaring rate of abortions. To stand in the gap for our youth of today who are struggling with so many issues, mental health issues, identity issues, self-harm. To stand in the gap for the hopeless, the hurting, the elderly, the addicts, the homeless, the downtrodden. And say enough. Not on my watch. This is not okay in 2023. And he's calling us as the church to rise up with a righteous anger, an anger that burns for justice, an anger that leaves a mark on our lives. He's calling us not to remain silent, not to sit back and think, well, this doesn't really directly affect me, so I think I can just forget about that. With favor comes responsibility, and with that responsibility comes action. To stand in the gap is action. To use our voice is action. To pray and fast and intercede is action. To be the go-between between God and our nation, God and those who are close to us, and those who we will never know and we will never meet. To stand in the gap, it takes obedience. Esther at first, she wasn't obedient. She didn't want to do what Mordecai was pleading her to do, to go to the king. In fact, she wanted to do the complete opposite, and we see that in chapter 4, verse 20. This is what she wrote back. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, this is Esther, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. You see, she was more concerned about her own life than she was about the 200,000 Jews. She discounted herself because the road that she was being asked to walk down was incredibly hard. It was incredibly complex. It was going to cost her something very significant. It seemed to her like it was an impossible task. And yet, just 5 verses later, this is what she says to Mordecai in verse 16. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. How did Esther go from no to if I perish, I perish? One word: obedience. Her feet went before her heart. God is looking for those who are willing to stand in the gap in obedience to him. Those who are willing to stand in the gap and tell the world that sin and injustice is wrong. Those who are willing to cry out for change. Those who are obedient. Edmund Burke says this: all that is necessary for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. We as Christians cannot do nothing. Esther was willing to lay down her life in order to stand in the gap for her people. When I was 15 years old, my mum became very unwell. And she went from being a person that would run around at 100 miles an hour to lying in her bed all day and all night, not being able to eat, not being able to speak, barely being able to lift her head from the pillow. And eventually, after much toing and froing with the doctor, she was finally diagnosed with ME, which is chronic fatigue syndrome. And she was in a really, really bad place. On a good day for my mum, it would be her sitting in an armchair for a couple of minutes. That would be her on a good day. And we, as a family, experience the effects of people standing in the gap for us. Those people who faithfully prayed for my mum, for healing for my mum, who faithfully prayed that she would get healed. These people fasted for her, they prayed for her, they interceded on her behalf. And then there were all the people that helped us practically as well during that time. And over that time, my mum did start to get better. And she could do more things. Like she could get out of bed and she could go in a car and go into town or whatever, but she'd be in a wheelchair. And she'd need a good sleep in the car on the way back or at home. But she did start to improve, but she was still in a lot of pain. And 10 years later, my mum was thanking God for her grandson, our eldest son, who was 1 at the time. And she was thanking him because when I was young, I was ill. And the doctor said because of the medication I was on, I was unlikely to ever have children. And so my mum was thanking God for her grandchild and for the life that he was, and for me to be able to have children. And then she felt the Lord say, "Don't you think I can do the same for you? I'm going to heal you." Now, my mum, she came away believing that. And she tucked that away inside herself, and she held on to that. And as time went on, nothing happened. But she kept hold of that word. Those faithfully praying and fasting and interceding, being the go-between between God and my mum, they held tight to that word. These faithful people, they stood in the gap for my mum for years and years and years. They interceded on her behalf, sometimes on their knees, sometimes with thanksgiving, sometimes with a huge amount of faith, sometimes with a tiny wee bit of faith, sometimes with heavy hearts, and sometimes with hearts full to bursting. These dear people obediently committed to bridging the gap between heaven and earth for my mum. Let's pick up the story again. Esther chapter 5, verse 1. This is what it says. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, and it will be given to you." So here we see Esther. She goes to the king, and the king spares her life. In fact, the king was pleased to see her, and he wanted to hear what her request was. And Esther invited the king and Haman to a banquet that day. And so as the king and Haman were there at the banquet enjoying themselves, the king then said to Esther, "Well, tell me, what is your request?" But instead of telling the king her request, she said, "Come to another banquet the following day." And so they come to the next banquet. And there they are, and they're eating, and everything's going really well. And then the king asks Esther her request. And she replied in chapter 7, verse 3, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, And if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. Esther, she makes her request before the king. And the king says, what man would dare do such a thing? He's got a bit of a short-term memory. And I like to picture there's Haman sitting over opposite Esther. And there he is, and he's literally stuffing his face, with banquet food. And his cheeks are out here like hamsters, and he's gobbling it all up. And then all of a sudden, he hears his name, and he looks up, and suddenly his eyes are like saucers, and he's gulping his food down because she points to Haman. What man would dare do such a thing? Esther points to Haman, and in that moment, he knows he's a goner. So far, Esther, she's had to go to the king 3 times. God's favor is still on her. Her life has been spared. And Haman, now we'll fast forward a bit, he's been impaled instead of Mordecai, because his plan was to impale Mordecai, but Haman has been impaled. I told you there was gore. But God's people, they're still living under a death sentence. And so what does Esther do? Again, she goes to the king. Chapter 8, verse 2. Esther again pleaded with the king. Falling at his feet and weeping, she begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. The king, he took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Notice here, Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. Going again costs Esther. It costs her her dignity, and it costs her her heart. She forgets all about her self-respect, and she just becomes wretched before the king because her heart has been broken for her people. Not only did she go again through obedience and through perseverance, but also in the breaking of her heart for her people. And this is a different side to Esther. We haven't seen this side of her before. You see, her heart has caught up with her feet. God has broken her heart for the Jewish nation. Now, they're not only her people, but she calls them my family. And we see this in verse 5. This is what she says. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he's pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? And then the king tells Esther and Mordecai to write another decree in the king's name to the Jews. As the first edict, it cannot be revoked because once the king has sealed it with his ring, you can't take it back. And so Esther and Mordecai, they write another decree, and it basically allows the Jews to defend themselves against anyone who tries to attack them, anyone who tries to harm them, which they successfully do. And suddenly the tables are turned, and the Jewish people have the upper hand, and no one could stand against them, and all their enemies were struck down. In Esther's obedience and perseverance to do what God had called her to do over the last 3 days, what does she see? She sees breakthrough. Even though she was on her own, God was with her. Every day over those 3 days, Esther chose to go again. God called her, awakened her, changed her selfish attitude, broke into her heart for her people, her family, to enable her to go again. Go again when all the odds were stacked against her. God is a God of again. He is the initiator. He who bought it will bring it back. He who did it will do it again. The Lord is the Lord of again, so that we can be people who go again. People who rise to the Lord's call again and again and again. People who go again after knockbacks. People who go again after disappointment of not seeing anything happen. Not seeing breakthrough. People who go again in the face of eating disorders and addiction and sickness. Where so often it can feel like one step forward and two steps back. People who go again to dare to pray and expect God to heal. When what we've seen before is others die or fall away or give in to temptation. We have to go again. Go again for the people in our nations. Go again for the people who don't know Jesus. Go again back to the foot of the cross. Go again back to the threshing floor of tears. Go again back to his temple of praise and his sanctuary of worship. Go again back to his glorious love and his promises. To finish, the story about my mum. 10 years after her hearing God say that he was going to heal her, they were at a Christian centre, a little retreat centre. And one morning, my mum went into the chapel there. There was no one around. There was just a big Bible. And she looked at the Bible, and it was open in Isaiah. And her eyes were just struck, just kind of drawn to one verse. And it was in Isaiah 38, verse 9. And it said, a writing of Hezekiah, king of Judah, after his illness and recovery. And my mum thought, could that be for me? I'm ill. Is it now my time to recover? The next day, my mum woke up with a very strong urge to climb a mountain. Yeah. And she said to my dad, I want to climb the mountain. And basically the retreat centre was situated at the foot of a big mountain. And my dad said to her, you're mad, because she couldn't even walk the path to start the journey to climb the mountain the day before. But my dad, being the kind and patient man that he was, he agreed. And he said to me, as we were halfway up the mountain, he said, I suddenly realised I had no phone signal, and what would happen if she collapsed, because I couldn't carry her down. Anyway, he didn't need to worry. My mum walked all the way up the mountain, and she walked all the way back down again. She woke up the next day, no aches, no pains, full of energy. She said to my dad, I want to walk into the village. The village was 5 miles away. So my dad said, the deal is, if we walk into the village, we're getting the bus back. Anyway, my mum walked into the village and she said, no, Keith, we're not getting the bus back. I'm walking back. And she walked the 5 miles back. And that continued day after day after day after day. Until one day, my mum said, the Lord has healed me. The Lord has healed me. And she has now more energy than my dad. The Lord completely transformed her life. The point is, my mum and dad and all those supporting them, praying and fasting for my mum's healing, they could have given up 10 years before. You know, when it looked like, well, God's forgotten. He's forgotten to follow through on what he promised. But instead, they chose to go again. Go again with faith. Go again to all that the Lord had spoken, believing that it will come to pass. They chose to go again, believing the impossible will happen. To go again, to pray and to fast and to intercede. To go again, to trust that God is in control. To go again, believing that she had not been forgotten. My mum's healing came in a chapel when no one else was around, reading one verse from the book of Isaiah, 20 years after she first got ill. God said, "Go again, Esther. Go again. Go again, Taryn. Go again. Go again, Vineyard Norway. Go again." Esther didn't waste the favor of God, the call of God, nor the opportunity that God had given her to play her part. He is a God of again, so that we can be people who go again for such a time as this. Why don't we stand?